Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our study of the year 1968. As we begin our study, it's impossible to start on January 1st, 1968 and just dive into the events of that year. We need to establish some background and context. How was it that a year like 1968 happened? What kind of conditions were in place leading up to that year? We could certainly go back as far as World War II or even earlier, and I will touch on some events from those earlier periods at times during these lectures. But I'll begin by going back to the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. For those of you with extensive background and knowledge about American history, you might want to skim through some of these lectures for your own benefit. But certainly, if you don't have much knowledge about American history heading into this course, you want to spend some time reviewing and listening to these lectures on the background in the 1950s and 60s. Dwight Eisenhower was elected the American president in 1952. He was, of course, the former great World War II general who had overseen the attack at Normandy on D-Day and many other elements of World War II. He was a welcome change from the previous president, Harry Truman, who came across as cold and calculating. In comparison, Eisenhower was likable. He struck many Americans as a grandfatherly type figure, smiling. He was known to bumble through press conferences from time to time and wander aimlessly in answering questions. But most historians agree he was shrewder than he let on to the American public. He was a great poker player and had many behind-the-scenes meetings where he illustrated a calculated knowledge of what was happening. In one briefing session for a press conference, he told some of his officials, "Don't worry, if that question comes up, I'll just confuse them." Eisenhower was subtler than Truman, but had a way of coaxing people to his side. "You don't lead by hitting people over the head," he once said. "Any damn fool can do that, but it's usually called assault, not leadership." Issues related to the Cold War, the rivalry with the Soviet Union, were front and center throughout the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, and in fact in 1968. We'll be talking about these issues much more extensively throughout these introductory lectures and in our lectures on 1968 itself. But Eisenhower was not as overtly confrontational as his predecessor Harry Truman. He didn't like the arms race, although by necessity he understood we had to continue to build weapons. He was in favor of utilizing intelligence and technology. As a former general himself, he understood the advantages that such factors could give. The CIA really came into its own during this period, planting spies and agents in other nations to influence policy. He believed in more bang for the buck, using nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear weapons, and the Air Force, rather than massive ground forces. His Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles, and the two worked very closely together. Dulles was a fiercely strong anti-communist. It was almost a biblical crusade for him. Together, Dulles and Eisenhower created a foreign policy they called the New Look. This policy emphasized nuclear weapons and air power. He didn't have an interest in maintaining lengthy engagements like the Korean War, especially not spread all over the world. He needed to rely on the threat of a quick and decisive attack rather than lengthy engagements. Thus, he relied on the idea of massive retaliation. Eisenhower was known to threaten and hint at the use of nuclear weapons, even in relatively small situations. This led to an idea that was sometimes called MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. It's during the Eisenhower presidency that the nuclear weaponry between the United States and the Soviet Union became sufficient to completely annihilate the entire world. Thus, either side, pressing the button so to speak, or starting World War III, would have led to the destruction of both sides. This leads to a tense standoff that extends over the next 30 years throughout the duration of the Cold War. And while ultimately we do survive, we're all still here. It leads to many tense situations during the Cold War itself. Another idea that gained currency during the Eisenhower presidency was the so-called Domino Theory, and you see a cartoon indicating the idea below. The Domino Theory relied on the fact that the Soviet Union was intent on conquering the entire world and spreading communism throughout the entire world. The idea was, if the United States allowed one nation, no matter how far-flung and small and seemingly insignificant, then the next would fall, and the next, and the next, like a series of dominoes, eventually leading to the United States itself. So, while containment continued to be the most prominent idea under Eisenhower, the policy accompanying it became nuclear deterrence. We would still attempt to stop the spread of communism wherever it might be threatening, but by using the threat of nuclear annihilation, rather than simply the injection of American troops. In general, the 1950s are a peaceful and prosperous time for the United States, as we'll see more when we talk about the home front during the 1950s in the next lecture or two. In terms of diplomacy, what this meant was that at times during the 1950s, it felt like we were getting close to peace, particularly with the Soviet Union. And we'll talk about détente in just a moment. In general, though, this meant that affairs in the 1950s became a little bit more complicated and touchy than they were in the Truman years. The Cold War becomes more than just a rivalry with the Soviet Union. It began spreading to many small nations around the world, at the fringes and the periphery of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry itself. And this was also an age when many nations were having revolutions and civil wars and trying to sort out their newfound independence in the aftermath of World War II. The United States' trend is to interpret each of these revolutions as a Soviet threat, so we instinctively supported any anti-communist leader, even if on closer inspection they were not necessarily desirable leaders. The United States found itself supporting a number of fanatical, murderous dictators, etc., finding itself supporting leaders who engaged in torture and many other nefarious means. We saw this in a number of Latin American countries and in Asia and Iran. This was an era under Eisenhower, utilizing increased covert CIA activity, secretly supporting leaders we desired, while secretly undermining unpopular leaders or communist leaders. In short, we had our blinders on during this period. Every problem spot became a perceived struggle against the Soviet Union. Many of these lesser countries, in turn, played off the United States against the Soviet Union, and thus tiny nations could become very troublesome for one or both of the superpowers. So in general, our policy in this era became more interventionist. We became more involved in many of these smaller nations around the world to protect against the perceived spread of communism. And this is certainly true, as we will see, in Vietnam. It's under Eisenhower that the United States really began its engagement, albeit on a small scale, in Vietnam. The Soviet leader during this era was Nikita Khrushchev, following the death of Stalin. Khrushchev and Eisenhower had an interesting relationship. While perhaps not quite friendly, they were far more cordial than Stalin and Truman had been, their predecessors. And both leaders accepted, to some degree, lowering the barriers of fear and complete lack of understanding about the other side. They also met personally a number of times in so-called summit meetings, and the two, in an odd way, got along, as they were, after all, the only two men on the planet who knew what it was like to be leading a superpower at the height of the Cold War. And while these summit meetings often didn't lead to groundbreaking and revolutionary new policies, they did contribute to a thawing somewhat of the Cold War during this era. And they contributed to the growing prominence and acceptance of cultural exchanges that have been nicknamed ping-pong diplomacy, in part because one of the exchanges involved table tennis players traveling around the world, but also because there is a metaphorical sort of ping-ponging back and forth of various cultural exchanges. Movies, radio, music, art, magazines, literature go from one side to the other, and experts like doctors, agricultural workers, and even athletes travel between the two sides and throughout the Cold War, Europe, and other parts of the world during this period. One of the best-known examples of this is the so-called Moscow Fair in 1956, when the United States sent an exhibit of cars, fashion, makeup, kitchen appliances, and so on. Russians lined up by the thousands to view this exhibit and couldn't believe that what were only rare luxuries in the Soviet Union were everyday items for most Americans. So the United States in general tried to weaken the Russian system through these kinds of cultural exchanges, giving Russian citizens the impression that American society was superior. Unfortunately, though, these cultural exchanges were only as successful as they were allowed to be during this time, because either side could turn away any of these experts whenever they wanted. And this was certainly true during a period of the refreeze of the Cold War after the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Practically speaking, the first space satellite, Sputnik, wasn't capable of accomplishing much. It was little more than a metal ball barreling through space, sending back simple signals to Soviets on the ground. But for Americans, Sputnik struck fear in their hearts. It wasn't so much what could Sputnik do itself. It was what was the next and the next item that the Soviets could launch into outer space, including nuclear weapons. And so this simple satellite contributed to extensive fear in the United States and launched the so-called space race. The United States, of course, started out behind in the space race and had to get up and running quickly. They created NASA in 1958 in an attempt to catch up. And in 1958, the United States launched its own satellite, and in 1959 announced Project Mercury, the first manned space program. The so-called Mercury 7, the first 7 American astronauts, were announced with great fanfare, and John Glenn, the leader among them, became a national celebrity. By the 1960s, the American space program had migrated through the Mercury program, the Gemini program, sending men into space with larger and larger support systems, and finally the Apollo missions, which sent the first men to the moon by the late 1960s. And those will, of course, become relevant in our discussion of 1968. So this thaw in the Cold War kind of bounced back and forth through the mid to late 1950s until on May 1st, 1960, an American spy plane called the U-2 spy plane was shot down deep in Soviet airspace. Eisenhower and the Americans bungled the issue, first denying everything, then mixing up their story, claiming what was shot down was a weather balloon or something to that effect. Eventually, the Soviets produced the pilot of the plane, Gary Powers, who had not been able to successfully swallow a cyanide pill and thus was very much alive to tell the whole story. It was a terribly embarrassing episode for Eisenhower and the Americans, and contributed to newfound frostiness in this era of the Cold War. The United States had to apologize and concede that there wouldn't be any more spy planes flying over Russia, and the atmosphere grew very tense. By the end of that year, there was a presidential election, won by John F. Kennedy over Richard Nixon. We'll talk more about that election. We'll talk more about Kennedy in the next couple of lectures. But after the U-2 spy plane incident, the Cold War entered one of its most intense periods.